Welcome to the Regenerative Brands podcast. This is a place for consumers, operators, and investors to learn about the consumer brands supporting regenerative agriculture and how they're changing the world. This is your host, Kyle, joined by my co-host, AC, who's going to take us into the episode.
On this episode, we have Pat Schnettler, who is one of the co-founders of 12 Tides. 12 Tides is supporting regenerative aquaculture with its kelp chips made from regenerative and organic kelp farmed in Maine and Alaska. In this episode, we learn about Pat's deep family roots in conservation and his personal journey that inspired the creation of 12 Tides. Plus, Pat educates us on how the company has already sold over 1 million bags of kelp chips. Let's go. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Regen Brands podcast. Super fired up today to have our friend Pat from 12 Tides here with us. So welcome, Pat.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, man. I've been a fan of 12 Tides for well over a year now. I wish I could remember the first place I saw it. It may have been Thrive. It may have been Erewhon. I can't recall, but I remember the first time trying your product thinking, like, this is the most delicious, tasty kelp snack I've ever tried. So we're super pumped to have you on board. But for those who have not tried 12 Tides, give our listeners kind of a lay of the land. What do you produce? How many SKUs do you have? Where can people find you today?
Yeah. Well, I'm Pat. I'm one of the co-founders of 12 Tides. We make ocean-positive foods with kelp from regenerative ocean farms here in the U.S. We currently have 5 SKUs, or 5 different flavors of our chips, which feature organic North American farmed kelp as the number 1 ingredient. And those are found in about 1,100 retailers on the western side of the U.S. right now, including Whole Foods, which would be the biggest. And we're also on all the major online platforms. So Thrive, Amazon, Imperfect, Misfits, Good Eggs, all that good stuff.
Nice. And what are the flavors?
Flavors are sea salt, the OG, and everything, and chili. That was the original 3, and then the 2 brand new flavors this year are vegan cheddar and truffle and pepper.
Hell yeah.
Nice. I've not tried the new flavors yet, except I think I might have tried truffle at Expo West when we chatted. I'm a huge fan of all 3 of the other ones. I think everything might be my favorite so far.
Yeah, they're all pretty good. We've been lucky enough that 3 out of the 5 were at least finalists at Expo West, and the sea salt won best organic food. So that was awesome. You probably did find us at Erewhon at the beginning. They're big fans of us over there, and we're big fans of Erewhon.
Yeah.
Erewhon was our first retailer. We've got several placements in every store now. We're one of the fastest moving products in the store. So they will have both of the new flavors as soon as they hit the DC.
Nice.
Heck yeah.
I love Erewhon, but it's like, they just rob me blind every time I go in there because I can just spend way too much money. Like I went to LA for like a week and I spent more money in that week than I usually spend on food in a month. And I was like, so happy to do it. But man, they're amazing. And they've really done a great job supporting the Regen brand. So hats off to Erewhon. Pat, we usually try and start by just getting people up to speed on kind of y'all's journey and the origin story. And the website has a really cool little timeline that gives a brief synopsis of it. And, y'all have had some really awesome success. I think getting over into 1,000 doors already, selling over 1 million bags of snacks. So just take us through kind of the origin story and how we got to where we're at today.
Yeah, well, I guess I'll start at the beginning. I sort of grew up in an ultra conservationist family. My mom worked for the Nature Conservancy for her entire career.
Wow.
My sister works for the National Marine Fisheries Service and NOAA in DC. And my brother just wrapped up his degree in environmental law and was going to follow a career in sort of the sustainability pathway as well. So I got involved in food and agriculture kind of early in my career for its intimate tie-in with the environment. And it was a little bit by chance, and then I think maybe a little bit from my sister because she's involved in seafood and the regulations of that around the U.S. And was involved in food and agriculture, kind of stumbled into seafood, and I did all sorts of seafood projects, either as an investor, consultant, operator around the world for the first 6 or 7 years of my career. So I worked on, give you a couple of examples. I worked on a 110, 120 meter factory trawling business up in Alaska. So it would be some of the biggest fishing vessels in the world. 400-person crews, and catching.
What were they fishing for?
They were fishing for pollock. Pollock is what you'd find in McDonald's fish fillet, very commodity, sort of low value fish in sort of mass trawl nets. And, you're catching 60 to 80 metric tons at a time, and hundreds of thousands of metric tons in a season. And, went from there, went down to, places like Pacifico Aquaculture in Ensenada, Mexico, that does net pen fish farming with striped bass. Spent some time over in Indonesia with World Fish doing brackish water shrimp farming project. Did some seafood and processing, either in the scallop fishery on the East Coast, down in Australia at Woolies, or over in Germany as well with Aldi. And so I saw a lot of the dark corners of the world of seafood. And we import about 90% of our seafood here in the US. Most of what's coming from abroad is going through a very long and opaque supply chain. And it's opaque for a reason. The industry wants it to be that way. They don't really want you to see where it came from in the beginning, both for its impacts on the environment and for its impacts on people. And I looked at all that stuff, and I thought it was horrifying. I wanted to dedicate my career to making that intersection between the oceans and the food system a little bit more sustainable. And I saw two ways of doing that. One was to try to make these horrifying industries like a little less bad. Or I'd started to, at the time, get to know a little bit about this idea of sort of regenerative ocean farming, and the idea that we can produce nutrient-dense food with zero inputs and have a net positive impact on the surrounding marine ecosystems. And while that was in its infancy and maybe a longer road to change, I thought it was more compelling for me than kind of the do less bad notion. And so
Hey, from a timeline perspective, when did regenerative ocean farming first get on your radar, and what was like the book or the conversation, or what was the first time you like kind of that was revealed to you in some way?
That is a good question. It was kind of back in like the 2016 time frame, and at that point, kelp farming was barely on anybody's radar. At the time, it was there was only a handful of producers in the U.S., maybe a very small handful of products. The industry was mostly funded and sort of supported by either government or academic research institution grants and stuff like that. And there wasn't really a big sort of industry behind it, but the potential was there for that to be the case. And well, I kind of looked at my skill set and I was like, well, I'm probably not going to be very good at farming kelp because I'm not a scientist or researcher. But I probably could help the industry, kind of sustain itself by finding high value end markets for kelp farmers, working directly with the farmers, paying farmers great prices. And that was kind of the impetus for 12 Tides. So I guess the point of, I think it was maybe a little bit, through my sister, because she's, involved in either setting, federal regulations around the permitting of these types of aquaculture sites, or, helping the states do that themselves, because, most aquaculture is done in state waters within 3 miles. and so I started to get to know some of these sort of pioneers in the space, or maybe some of the very early operations, some of which
Hmm.
made it, some of which didn't. But I was always pretty aware and excited about the potential that it had, both for marine ecosystems and for coastal communities that have been maybe largely dependent on sort of declining legacy seafood industries.
Mm. So many parallels. We just had Bree from Atlantic Sea Farms on, and y'all are talking about a lot of the same things, maybe with a little bit different articulation, but definitely feel like we got like a PhD level education on a lot of these topics from her, and we're adding to that today. So just excited for that. And it seems like these are one of the most like kelp's one of the most no-brainer agricultural things ever to me after kind of getting it explained to me. I think one thing we talked about with Bree and kind of the question I want to get to for you, Pat, is like, how do we get the American consumer to consume more kelp, right? And so would love to kind of know how you went from, okay, kelp's this cool thing, to like, let's put it in a salty snack, right? How did you get there, and what was the impetus for that?
Yeah, so there were a few reasons we developed the first product. Number one is that it has to taste great. That
Mm-hmm.
it's just a non-negotiable, and I think that's especially important with an ingredient innovation like kelp, because for the vast majority of our consumers, trying our product is their first experience trying kelp, and if that's
Mm.
not a good experience, kelp is dead to them forever.
Mm-hmm.
And so we
No
are
pressure.
pretty Yeah, we're pretty ruthless on quality. We're pretty ruthless on um, our product development process. We're not going to put out something that's mediocre and then hope to fix it later.
Mm.
Uh, and we developed the chips because it was something that you could. It was kind of a low barrier to entry. I'm not dedicating a whole meal to this, or I'm not,
Mm.
buying something for $37 and taking that kind of risk. And it is also something that you can eat right out of the bag. You don't have to trust somebody to cook with it or pair it with something else, and then maybe they screw it up, and you have that bad first experience with kelp. Uh, so the idea of eating something right out of the bag was appealing. Um, and then lastly was that it was something that was unique. We
Mm.
our chips have a very unique sort of flavor profile and texture because we make our chips unlike any other snack food manufacturer, and we use a lot of the unique characteristics of kelp to help create that texture and that flavor profile. And so what that does is, when people do try us for the first time and they like us, there's you can't just like grab the next bag of chips on the shelf. It's too far
Mm.
away from the same thing. And so um, that's it's a little bit of the hook, um, but it was a long road in developing the first product for sure. Very difficult. We spent a year at farmers markets, um, which is hard yards, and I have incredible. I won't go on that tangent, but like incredible appreciation for everybody who sells at farmers markets after
Yeah.
doing it myself. Um, but we spent about a year doing that, and we ultimately launched at Erewhon, was our first retailer in November of 2020, and um, kind of took off from there.
Nice.
I'd love to dive in a little bit deeper, and we keep having these puns. That was not an intended fishing ocean pun. You also mentioned the hook a moment ago, another like
I've
natural
got a
pun
lot of
there.
them. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, hey, let's keep working them in, see how many we can get. Um, but I mean, you mentioned like the chip itself is, or the puff is, I guess it's a chip, kelp chip, puffed kelp chip.
Mhm.
Um, you kind of developed that texture, that concept based on the attributes of the seaweed. I'd like to know a little bit more about that, and then also that transition from farmers market to Air One for a young brand. The packaging is stellar. The marketing is killer. Like I
Hmm.
rarely see brands at the tenure that you're at this well dialed in. So talk to us about how you were able to develop those concepts, who you worked with from the branding side, because it's really well done. And I keep looking over here because I've got it up right now, the website, and it looks killer. So walk us through that
Hmm.
transition.
Yeah. So we sold at almost all the farmers markets around the Bay Area for about a year. And the point of that was not to generate sales. It
Mm-hmm.
was to get feedback. And
Right.
farmers markets are an incredible opportunity to get feedback. In 4 or 5 hours, you can get 500 impressions for the price of $50 per
Right.
market per week, and like you can't get that kind of volume of data anywhere else for that price. And so while it is, I mean, you have to control for the fact that it's kind of a unique consumer and
Mm-hmm.
uh, maybe not representative of the full population. It's a very good testing ground. And so, every week I would come back with a different, footprint of the chip, or a different, thickness or shape, or different flavors. We tried all sorts of different flavors to see, like, which ones really stuck, and different attributes too, like, having sugar in one of our products for like a little
Hmm.
bit of sweetness versus not having sugar. Um, Turns out people really want like one chip in the whole freaking chip aisle that like doesn't have sugar in it.
Hmm.
So, we scratched any sort of like sugar off of all of our products. But when I got to the point, I remember I had one market where there were 3 or 4 people who found me in the parking lot. You get there pretty early. It's like 6 or 6:30 in the morning,
Yeah.
and they had like cash in their hand, and they wanted to buy like cases of the product because
Wow.
they knew that once I set up, I was going to sell out, because we sold out at every market.
Yeah.
We, didn't have really huge production capability at the time, um, and that wasn't really the point, to generate sales. But when people started coming to me and offering cash to buy cases before the market started, because they were worried they were going to yell out and I was going to sell out, and their family loves them, and
Yeah.
I was like, okay, now I feel like we're in a good spot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would imagine that'd be an exciting time. Clearly, demand is in a good position. So you get there, and then you're like, okay, I need to take this to the next level.
Mm-hmm.
What does it look like from ramping up production? Like I mentioned, the packaging, the design. Like, how does that happen?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'll maybe like take a different tact at that answer. So, at that time, yeah, we knew we were ready to go into retail, or even slightly before that, we knew that that was going to be the next step, and so we started to think about that. And having came from a background in seafood, and as you can probably imagine, branding and marketing and design is not the typical area of expertise of the seafood industry generally.
Right.
And so I knew that I had no value there.
Yeah.
And I think what I would tell maybe other people who are starting a food brand, kind of know what your strengths are, and
Mm-hmm.
really dedicate those strengths to the brand and to the
Mm-hmm.
company, and then know what you're not so good at,
Mm-hmm.
and go find somebody who is really good at that, and let them take ownership over that piece. And so I knew I was going to be no good at the branding and marketing side of things, but I had the chance when we were at the farmers market stage to meet my co-founder Lindsay, who did branding and marketing for Alter Eco, a very
Ah, there
organic
we
chocolate
go.
company,
Yeah.
and she took over on all of the design, all of the community and social media, and all of the website and stuff like that. And so um, that's sort of how I, rather than like hiring an agency or something, just like
Mm-hmm.
get somebody on the team who is an expert in that and who can
Mm-hmm.
Right.
uh, run that side of the business.
Was the brand
Makes
called 12 Tides at that time, Pat, or did she come up with that name? And what does that name mean?
Yeah, it was called 12 Tides. I came up with that kind of in the early days. And we actually decided to keep it. We kind of tossed around, when we were going to do because at the farmer's market, I was selling in like these brown bags. And I was like
Mm-hmm.
putting stamps on them. And so there was
classic fisherman
no
move.
commitment to the brand at the time. But uh, it had a nice ring to it. It was a
Yeah.
unique name. Um, it came from the idea that the vast majority of seaweeds grow in the intertidal areas of the oceans. So high tide submerged, low tide visible, and there are 12 hours between the tides.
That's dope.
Interesting.
That's
Yep.
cool.
Yeah, clever. And I mean, it totally makes sense having, Lindsay with her chops. So you can tell like there's some serious brand chops behind 12 Tides. And again, like to have that as early on as you did it is probably super beneficial for the level of growth you've had, in addition to, the quality of the product. So it's just a killer 1-2 punch out of the gate. Um, one of the things we like to ask is like, generally speaking, how does your product differ from like a quote conventional non-regenerative version of your product? But that doesn't really exist for kelp and seed products. So I guess from an impact perspective, educate us a little bit and our listeners about like why consuming kelp is such a good thing.
Yeah. So unlike pretty much any other form of aquaculture, kelp is a net positive for the surrounding marine ecosystems. And it does a couple of things in particular. Number one is that kelp grows incredibly fast. Giant wild kelp can grow up to 2 feet in a day. Our kelp, at maximum will grow up to a foot in a day or a little bit less.
Wow.
In doing so, it absorbs carbon from the ocean at a similarly fast pace. Call it twice that of the Amazon on a per acre basis. And that, what causes the oceanic acidification is the transfer of atmospheric carbon dioxide into the surface waters. That CO2 combines with H2O to make carbonic acid. That causes acidification. So if you're absorbing that into a different pathway of kelp farming, you can mitigate oceanic acidification on sort of a localized level. That's the biggest impact, because oceanic acidification is one of the greatest risks to biodiversity on the planet. And, outside of just the oceans, just on the planet in general. And, ways to mitigate that, not only have sort of the direct impact of the mitigation, but just cascading impacts of, throughout the entire food chain and the way the whole marine ecosystems can, absorb and sequester carbon. So that's one of the, I think, really driving elements of the regenerative components of kelp. It also does all sorts of different things. So second is that it can absorb excess nitrogen and other nutrients that run off from terrestrial fertilizers that also create problems for coastal ecosystems. Provides food and shelter for all sorts of marine life. There's like a 30 to 40% increase in both biodiversity and abundance of marine life inside of a kelp farm versus outside.
Wow.
And lastly is that it does all that in an enormously resource efficient manner, because it doesn't require any fresh water, no pesticides, no fertilizers, no arable land. And so you're not having to use an enormous amount of resources to create those benefits. It's almost input free.
And Pat, you mentioned there's sugar kelp and there's giant kelp, and you guys have a really cool little infographic on the website that kind of describes the difference. The sugar kelp is what's in the products. The giant kelp, it sounds like it's not in food. Talk about the difference between what those are, where they're grown, and how like the benefits might be different, or why it's important to be educated on those two different types of kelp.
Yeah, it's a great point. It's a great question. So we get a lot of questions from our consumers about, well, you guys are talking all about like the importance of kelp to the ecosystems and, how incredible it is, but like, why are you harvesting it then and putting it into your chicken? Isn't that a bad thing? And I think it's a good question.
So,
yeah, valid point. So we do two different things with kelp, and I think this is kind of under the general umbrella that more kelp in the ocean is better.
Yeah.
And the first thing that we do is kelp farming. And so kelp farming is, kelp that is, propagated in a nursery and then ultimately grown out in the ocean. None of that kelp would have grown there anyways, because they're grown from suspended lines. And we don't take anything out of the ocean that we didn't put there in the first place.
Mhm.
So that would be number one. And you still accrue all of those benefits of that kelp being there during, um, for the bulk of the year in sort of the growing season, um, and during some important times of the year for the marine ecosystem.
Yeah.
Uh, and then separately, we also, California and the west coast of the U.S. has experienced a 90% decline of wild kelp populations due to
90?
90%, yeah, over the
Wow.
past 2 decades.
Wow.
And that is mostly due to kind of various impacts of climate change, um, and some more direct kind of man-made uh, factors. But
Pat, I want you to check me on
essentially,
this. I grew up in Southern California and I witnessed a lot of what you're talking about, the lack
Mhm.
of kelp out there. I'm a big scuba diver, free diver, used to be a spear fisherman. Spent a lot of time swimming through California kelp and those kelp forests, and it's absolutely beautiful. Um, One of the things I've been told is that the lack of predator for the purple sea urchin in particular is one of the keys to the degradation of that
Hmm.
ecosystem environment. So essentially, like the purple sea urchin is overpopulated because that system is no longer in check because the otter is no longer in California, and they're
mhm.
decimating the attachment areas for kelp on the rocky coast. So the kelp can't stick, so it just floats away. Is that correct?
Yeah, and the urchins actually eat the kelp. They
Mm.
eat it directly. In addition to sort of ridding the zone of any sort of attachment points. And so the big event was in 2014, 2015, and it was sort of climate change fueled warming, abnormal warming event for ocean temperatures in that area, which created a sea star wasting disease, which would be the number one predator of the purple urchin. And after that, the purple urchin just, you're right, they lost all of their predators, and the populations just exploded. And
Mm.
it's basically created these sort of urchin barrens, which, it used to be kind of maybe thriving marine life inside of a kelp forest, and now it's just a seafloor full of purple urchins. And these urchins have no commercial value because they're basically starving and don't really have any meat or uni on them, so to speak. And uh, they can live for a very long time with no food, just kind of starving there on the bottom. And so what we've started to do, and what we work with our nonprofits to do, is to basically clear some of these urchin barrens and help the kelp repopulate,
Hmm.
slowly, sort of meter, square meter by square meter, up and down the coast. But it is starting to improve a little bit over the past, couple seasons. It will take some more time, but we do want to help accelerate the process to bring back that natural kelp. And so, back under the umbrella of more kelp in the ocean is good. That's, we have the farming side of it, and then we also have the repopulating the natural
Hmm.
kelp side of it, which kind of two different ways to get to the same end.
And on the farming side, Pat, are you guys vertically integrated or you just buy kelp from certified organic suppliers?
Yeah, we work directly with the farms. We get kelp straight from the farmers. We don't do any of the farming ourselves.
Okay.
Um, but I just got back from a 2 week trip. So we source both from Alaska and Maine.
Nice.
Um, we were traveling around for quite a bit, visiting all of our farmers during the harvest season. Harvest season's right now, by the way. And so we do have those really tight relationships. And our goal is to help the whole kelp farming industry and ecosystem grow. And so,
Yeah.
we work closely with the farmers to, help them decide what kind of, processing capabilities they might need. We make commitments before the growing season, starts, and put down deposits to help them finance the growing season. And so, uh, our goal is to create, um, a really positive and farmer friendly,
Yeah.
kelp farming ecosystem, and avoid a lot of the pitfalls that other industries of terrestrial farming have fell into. um, with 12 tides.
And
Makes a lot of
two
sense.
questions. Yeah, two questions there. How does USDA organic work for like aquaculture based product like kelp? And then when you buy the kelp from the farmers, you buying it in powder form, you buying it in dried kelp, you buying it in wet kelp in bags. Like, just help me visualize, kelp from the ocean, and then it ends up in a chip, right? Or yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So, how does USDA organic certification work? It's a good question. There's no such thing as organic seafood, and so we get that question a lot as to like, you know, organic fish is fake. Like, how can your seaweed be
Mm,
certified organic? So, it's a good point. But actually, one of our farmers was sort of the leader in creating the organic standard for kelp and seaweed farming
wow.
in Maine.
Super
And I
cool.
think, right now, I wouldn't say there's a dramatic difference between, organic and non-organic farms. There's no big like commercial or industrial kelp farming that's happening in the U.S. right now.
Yeah.
I think the goal for the organic process and the organic certification for kelp is to, use that to help the whole industry, um, stay or sort of keep out of the pitfalls of big terrestrial agriculture and, a
Mm,
lot of the mistakes that were made there during the 60s and 70s,
mm,
um, and really set that high bar for, the ecological outcomes of kelp farming.
mm,
Um, because it is somewhat of I don't want to say unregulated, but kind of a wild west
mm,
uh, of agriculture right now.
mm,
In terms of how we get the kelp, we work with the farmers to get it in, and we get it from different formats from different farmers based on their processing capabilities. We don't want their ability to invest in some huge capital asset to do
yeah.
certain amounts of processing to prevent us from working with them. If they can get it to a different format than this farmer, we'll find a way to take it from there, and we can work with a large array of farmers to do that. And we're also working with both farmers in Maine and Alaska to decide like, oh, okay, like if we want to invest in this, can we co-invest? Is there some sort of
Yeah.
like, outside funding that we can pursue to, try to do this together? And so there's a lot of sort of creative solutions that are out there, and I think will help the industry grow in the future, but it's still pretty early.
Yeah.
Why is growing kelp hard, and why does it seem to be predominantly, at least in North
Yeah.
America, Alaska, Maine? How come it's not happening on more coastal lands?
So from my perspective, so almost all of California, with the exception of like maybe one farm in California, which is in federal waters, all kelp farms are in state waters, which is within 3 miles of the coast. And
Mm,
so all of the regulations are state by state. And there's nothing really confirming this is sort of my opinion, but I think the states that are most reliant economically on declining legacy seafood industries are the states that are most incentivized to create a
mm,
regulatory pathway and to
mm,
support the creation of this new kelp farming industry. And
mm.
those two states in the United States would be Maine and Alaska.
Yeah.
And so if you look at a state
Makes
like
sense.
California, there's definitely people who are interested in it, and there's a lot of potential and opportunity for kelp farming to be a thing off the coast. But if you're a California regulator and you're looking at, our economic like pie chart, and like seafood is this tiny, tiny, tiny sliver, it's just hard to get
Yeah.
anybody to pay attention.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm. That's frustrating. As a
It
California
is
native
very
who knows the
frustrating.
impact of having kelp forests, yeah, would love to see
Yeah.
that change. But it's a good point. If that's the bottleneck, that's the bottleneck.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's entirely a regulatory matter. There's also kind of, some constraining factors, like there's more competition for coastline in places like the
Mm,
West Coast, Alaska, but um, it's
hmm.
mostly a regulatory matter. And the other challenge from a regulatory standpoint is that aquaculture has very bad is bad word in for most regulators. And
Mm,
most of the time when you say aquaculture, people think of like net pen salmon farms.
right.
And
Mm.
that is horrifying, and I would be horrified by that too. But it's a big leap to try to articulate why. Okay, it's not net pen salmon farms. These are seaweed farms, and they do good for the environment instead of what net pen salmon farms do. But it's a bigger leap to make with regulators than it sounds.
Mm-hmm. And
Educate us a little bit about why net pen salmon farming and aquaculture has such a bad name, and why people
mm,
are they don't really want to open that box if they can choose to avoid
Ooh, um,
it.
well, oh boy, yeah. There's a lot there. I think some of the highlights from my because I worked on a net pen fish farm down in Mexico, and there are better ways to do that than certain operations do it better than others,
mm,
for sure. But there's a few factors. Number one is that it's pretty resource intensive. You have to feed the fish quite a lot, all the way from the sort of hatchery nursery stage through the grow out. In a lot of cases, you're feeding them other wild caught fish. So, you know, while you might be like mitigating pressure on wild caught populations with the farming, you're feeding them wild
mm,
fish from here. So, um, secondly, is that the influx of feed and sort of these artificially dense populations of fish can have negative implications for surrounding marine ecosystems.
mm,
Whether that's a whole bunch of feed that's falling through the pen and stacking up on the bottom, and other species become dependent on that, or it injects a whole bunch of extra kind of nitrogen into the water there. It can be sort of disruptive from that perspective. And lastly is that uh, net pen salmon farms are pretty well known for some pretty horrendous sort of lice and pathogen problems, and so
mm,
you've
Hmm.
got all sorts of uh, kind of antibiotic issues that occur or get sort of distributed throughout those net pens. The lice problems are horrific, both for the salmon in the pens as well as the ecosystems outside of that. And then lastly, and I think this is probably the one that's been like most popularized, most talked about in Canada, would be the escapes. And so, escapes they happen. They're not infrequent and can have, all of a sudden you have kind of this new population of fish that is competing against other
mm.
resources, can have sort of unknown consequences. I think really, um, the sort of the scariest thing is just the unknown. Like what will
Right.
happen if this
Mhm.
fish escapes and integrates with the wild population. So uh, all sorts of
So
things.
I guess
They have
genetically speaking, are there significant differences between the farmed fish and the wild fish? 'Cause
yes,
in my
yes.
mind, if it's the same fish, it's like what's the issue? But yeah, so walk us
Mm,
through like why that's a bad thing.
Um, yeah, and it really, I guess I'll talk about salmon. So it's like, one of the complicating things of seafood is that um, it's hard to talk about sustainable seafood in very broad strokes because
yeah.
unlike chicken, beef, pork, where that's all like one species, it's farmed in like the same like one, two, or three methods like across the U.S. In seafood, you have hundreds and hundreds of species, and then
Mhm.
you have for each species like wild caught and aquaculture, and then within wild caught you have all sorts of different regions and gear types and um, processing methods, and those all have different sort of sustainability implications.
Right.
And so it's hard to make kind of like broad sweeping statements about seafood because it's so complicated
Right.
to identify what's good and what's not good. um, for salmon, I think I think something that a lot of people find interesting is that when you see Atlantic salmon on a menu, that's farm salmon. There's
Mm,
Hmm.
pretty much no such thing as wild Atlantic salmon anymore. Atlantic salmon equals farm salmon. I always get a good chuckle when I see on a menu that it's like wild Atlantic salmon. Like that's kind of not really a thing. It's yeah. So, but I think that's like kind of one of the distinguishing factors, for salmon, and then you have to look at that's probably coming from either Norway or Chile, and from my point of view, the wild caught salmon coming from Alaska, tends to be a better option, but it's not always apparent, what's good and what's coming from Alaska and what's less good.
Right.
Going back to kelp, where my mind goes with this whole thing is like, this is amazing. How do we get more people to eat it? Right. Mm-hmm. So that's a product development question, and that's a marketing question. Right. So Pat, talk to us about why you started like in salty snacks, what's to come in terms of product development, and like, how do we get people to eat more kelp? Like what is the grandiose vision there? Because that, I think, is the whole unlock to solving some of these problems.
Yeah, I think it kind of goes back to the very first thing I said, is that you have to have products that taste good. It's impossible to do without that. Mm-hmm. And so we've dedicated a lot, and I think you can only have so many like core competencies as a company and as a brand, but we need to make sure that product development and quality is one of those for us. And that's particularly important for us because we manufacture our own products and we do all of our own product. If you're a company that's outsourcing that stuff, and you've chosen to outsource it, and maybe that it's not your core like internal competency. But for us, it's really one of the most important things. And then you got to make products that I think people don't have to make other sacrifices in what they're looking for in a food product in order to eat, pick your product out of all of the ones on the shelf. And so, we're kind of designing products within trends that we think will be, longer term trends. And then you've got to use the sustainability element and the kelp storytelling to sort of separate yourself from everything else on the shelf, and to drive some of that brand loyalty that can keep people engaged and excited and looking for your product every time they go to the store. A lot of people have kelp tattoos, including myself.
What are some of those long-term trends you're trying to integrate into the design process? Like, what are some of the things y'all are betting on?
Into the product design?
Yeah.
I think, so we really focus on ingredients. I think diet trends come and go. And so I think, a particular kind of like nutritional element or anything like that, or being keto, or I don't even know what like the next version of that is. I don't really pay attention to the diet trends, but those things always come and go. So we don't want to like lean too heavily on that stuff, but we do want to lean heavily on clean, high quality and traceable ingredients. And I can't really see a world, I could be wrong, but I can't really see a world where 10 or 15 years from now, people are like, I don't care where my ingredients come from, or like I want like low quality, like cheap ingredients, or I want stuff on my ingredient label that I can't pronounce and I have no idea what it's made of. So those are the types of things that we really focus on, and they're simple, but it's not a given, especially when you're co-manufacturing a product and you just or you have somebody else developing your product, and there's this weird like prevailing wisdom. Like we've spoken to co-packers and external product development agencies in the past, and they're like, they really want this weird shit to be in the product. I just don't know why they want it to be there. They really want it. And
you're holding the line.
we make it a point to just kind of follow our own compass on that.
Yeah.
My guess is they want it in the product because they have a contractual obligation as a co-man to purchase a certain quantity from that supplier. So the more that they
Mm,
can use, they get to keep that price point low. That's
mm,
pure speculation, but that's my guess as to why this stuff ends up. Because I mean, I was looking at
That's a great
ibuprofen the
point.
other day, and there's like Red 5 in ibuprofen. It's like, why on earth would a brand pay
right.
money to put a food coloring in a like a Tylenol pill? Like this just doesn't make any
Mm,
sense, you know?
mm.
Nobody
Um,
cares that it's red, that the pill's red.
exactly, exactly. Like it's so weird. And that totally brought me away from the train of thought I was going on, and I completely lost my question. So I apologize.
Uh,
It was a good one. I had a
yeah,
really good
man. I
one
mean, I,
lined
I
up.
could go on a tangent for that of like for. I mean, that's a really interesting point. I've actually never heard that one before. That
Mm,
they have contractual quantities, but it does. And I always got this sense, and I know there's a lot of different perspectives on using co-packers. Um, but I think that's another good example of like the co-packer doesn't always have your best interest in mind. Like
right.
maybe they want to put this into the product because they've got a bunch of it left over. They've got this contract or outstanding
Mm,
PO or something that. Um, and I went into this with a healthy dose of skepticism about co-packers, and we found self manufacturing is the hard way to do it for sure,
yeah,
without
for sure.
without
Totally.
doubt. But I don't know. I every time I'm like dealing with, we had some like transformer like blow up downstairs, and I've got to like dig back into my electrical engineering like background, like rewire it or like go buy another
Hmm.
one. I'm like, you know what? Well, we could have had a co-packer who like decided to drop us one day, and then the like whole business like shuts down. So
Hmm.
Right.
maybe you know almost blowing myself up with like a you know three-phase switch or something that I'm trying to replace was worth it.
Yeah.
That could work. I remember my question. We were talking about trends and ingredients like that, and there was a recent switch 12 Tides made um, from an ingredient perspective that I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share, like why you switched from ingredient A to ingredient B, and how you feel your consumers are responding to that shift.
Yeah. So we switched from sunflower oil to avocado oil, and that was based on consumer feedback. There's a lot of hesitancy toward seed oils nowadays, and I think
Hmm.
it's not um, unfounded. I think there's um, a lot of health implications related to that. I'm not like super privy to like a lot of the details, but we heard a lot from consumers, and so
Hmm.
we didn't do that originally. Um, and it was some like advice at the beginning. It's like, oh, like you have to use sunflower oil, like so much cheaper than
Mm.
whatever. Like we didn't have to, like we just did it, and so that was one thing that got us like moving towards sunflower oil originally was everybody uses sunflower oil, you have to do it, it's so much cheaper. Um, the thing with us is that if you're frying something and you're filling up like vats of oil to like fry stuff, like I could see how those pennies like really add up. But for us, we just spray on a little, like ours are kind of baked, and then we just spray on a tiny bit of oil at the end, and so it
Mm.
ends up being a very small quantity, and so that change per pound is not super consequential to us.
Hmm.
The deciding factor at the beginning was actually um, shelf life concerns
Hmm.
about avocado oil or about something that was not this high oleic sunflower oil, which is very stable.
Hmm.
Um, and I heard a story from somebody. It was actually John Foraker at
Once upon a
um,
farm.
Once Upon a Farm, and talking
Hmm.
about his time at Annie's, how
Hmm.
they had used a wrong oil in one of their batches of I think like bunny crackers or something like that, and just basically had a whole bunch of crackers kind of go rancid in the field.
Mm. Mm.
And I was like, geez, like we're already doing so many different things. We got the compostable packaging, we've got this kelp ingredient, we're manufacturing everything ourselves. Like, only so many things that we can kind of worry about at the outset, and
Hmm.
I'm not sure if we want to like chance it that we're using an oil that could go rancid out there, especially because our packaging doesn't have the barriers of BOPP or like regular chip packaging.
Hmm.
And so it's like, you know what, we're fighting too many battles already. Like, we'll start with sunflower oil to make sure we don't F it up, and then if we think we can move to avocado oil, later we'll do that.
Hmm.
And that transition has happened. Is it already like rolled out in retail? So people buying your product today will like that will be on shelf, or is that still like coming in future manufacturing runs?
No, it's in the two new SKUs. The two new SKUs are avocado oil. So anywhere you find those, that will be the case. And then we're like working through the last bit of packaging of the other ones, and then those will all switch over to
Hmm.
avocado oil as well. Um, so yeah, I mean it's kind of like imminent. Probably
Right.
by the time this episode airs, it'll be
Yeah.
switched up to avocado oil.
Pat, what has really been catalytic in terms of consumer trial and repurchase at retail? You come from the background of, getting to do a bunch of that at farmers markets, right? And then
Yeah.
you get into these retail behemoths, the big machines like a Whole Foods, and we've
Mm-hmm.
had some really interesting stories from different regenerative brands as to what's worked. Sometimes it's always just trade spend. Sometimes it's sampling. Sometimes it's TikTok. This one video goes viral. Like what's been working for y'all?
Yeah, so we've developed a pretty good playbook of, um, you know, getting that community of super fans at every single retailer. And so we've been like pretty
Mm,
selective about the retailers that we've gone into, and
smart.
we've done so at a pretty controlled pace.
Hmm.
And so what we try to do in every single new retail store is that we'll use a combination of demos and brand ambassador engagement. We'll engage with the store employees and like make them fans of the brand. We'll do the off-shelf placements and stuff like that to help drive trial. And our goal is to get those 20, 30. You don't need a lot of people. It's like 20 or 30 like people per store who are going to come in every single week and buy like 1, 2, 3 bags.
Hmm.
Um, be a good velocity brand in the set.
Hmm.
And that does two things. It's like number one, it like make sure that you're a strong performing brand, and you're not going to like
Hmm.
fall off the shelf. If you are a strong moving brand, um, you are going to, and this is the kicker. This is like the flywheel. So if you start doing well, and we've seen this at Erewhon, the store really likes you, and the store really
Yeah.
likes you. They give you more placements, and then you start doing better, and
Hmm.
then the store likes you even more, and like starts giving you, you know, free secondaries or end cap display. They do the K stack deals because they love that, and
Yep.
um, you get it becomes kind of like this flywheel, and so we want to create that at every store, as many stores as we possibly can, and that's when you're kind of in a good place. And so we don't um, bite off a new region or a new big retailer until we know we've created that flywheel,
Hmm.
at the vast majority of the stores that we're already in.
Smart.
Super
Maintain that
cool. Yeah.
profitability. Don't overinvest and go
Hmm.
too wide before you've created that depth, right? Um,
Yeah,
two questions.
yeah, because if you
One,
have to like over promote to try to like drive velocities across a really big region like all at once, and like your product's barely moving off the shelf, like
Hmm.
that can become bananas
Burning
expensive.
cash. Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah. Two questions. One, you have a relatively unique product in that it's a kelp chip, and there's like a seaweed set, and there's a chip set. Like, where is your
Yep.
product typically merchandised in store? And then point two, kind of expanding from there, what's the future of 12 Tides Hold? Are you planning to go into some new categories, new channels? Are you looking to expand with more flavors? What does that look like?
Yeah, so we want to be in chips, or more frequently, we're kind of in the better for you snacks, kind of like alternative ingredient snacks.
Hmm.
So that would be like next to the kale chips, the plantain chips,
Yeah.
pea crisps, things like that. That's kind of our sweet spot. Sometimes we're in like the more general chips aisle, which is also okay. And uh, lastly is that in a few places we might be in like the seaweed set, but we don't really like to be there because a lot of times that would be in like sort of an ethnic aisle with like other like Asian like meal prep types of things. And I think
Mm.
number one is that our products have just a much different kind of flavor and textural profile and a different use case than people
Hmm.
who are
Right.
shopping that aisle. And then secondly is that all of those seaweed products that you find there all are coming from Asia. And a lot of times
Right.
they have either Asian, it's kind of like an Asian brand story or Asian flavor profiles and stuff like that. And that's just not really our product. It's obviously all coming from the US. And so we try to, oh, and the last thing is a lot of people that don't like those seaweed sheets end up liking our product anyways. And so we
Hmm.
don't want to affiliate ourselves with that because, we don't want
Mm-hmm.
people to think, well, oh, I didn't like that, so I'm not going to like this either. It's not
Right.
really the case. So we like to stay away from that set.
Mm-hmm.
Makes sense.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I'm assuming you're probably not going to start creating seaweed sheets here in the near future. But what else will 12 Tides potentially create in the future?
No, and it's a good question, but it's and we're not I'm not like opposed to that product form in general, but it's actually a trait of the seaweed. And so
Mm.
those seaweed sheets are made from a red seaweed called nori. That
Mm.
is the predominant seaweed over in Asia, at least for human consumption. And though nori is a very thin, kind of paper thin seaweed that when
Hmm.
you dry it, you can kind of get this, nice thin sushi like sheet.
Mm-hmm.
You couldn't really do the same with our seaweed. And so
Mm.
it's just it's kind of like blueberries to potatoes type of comparison. It's just like a different,
Wow.
um, and so, yeah, like going forward, I guess, stepping into your next question is that we want to continue to develop products that use the unique sort of flavor and textural profile of the seaweeds that our farmers grow here in the U.S. Um, to make really unique and really tasty products that help grow kelp as an industry in the U.S., help grow the idea of eating products that have a net positive impact on the oceans, and help encourage people to think about the impact that their daily life choices have on the oceans. It's kind of the broad, mission of the brand.
Mm. Love that, man. Perfect segue into our closing question, which is one we asked everybody, which is how do we get regen brands to have 50% market share by 2050?
Interesting. It's an interesting question. I think um, I think brands supporting each other because
Mm.
those every brand maybe has captured like a little subset of
Right.
their consumers, but all of those consumers have sort of the general interest of this idea of like a regenerative food ingredient. And so I think with a little bit of collaboration, we do this all the time with other types of brands, but
Mm-hmm.
um, sharing the people who are really interested in that regenerative wheat or regenerative beef with the idea of regenerative ocean foods. Like there's
Right.
values overlap with those consumers that I
Yep.
think can be shared, and at least the consumers that are already interested in buying regenerative products can do more of that throughout their entire grocery cart rather than just like that one brand that they learned about and really love.
Mm-hmm.
um, I think that's one sort of component of it. um, and then there's the capturing new consumers,
Mm-hmm.
and bringing new consumers into the regenerative story. And I think at least the way we do that is by connecting back to values that people um, sort of hold near and dear, and kind of reflect those values in our product. And so for us, that's just talking about the ocean. And I very
Mm-hmm.
rarely I think people look back on their time with the ocean and they're like, screw that place, hate
Yeah.
that. And
I don't know
so,
anyone that feels that way for sure.
yeah. And so I think just, articulating, why making this particular choice can help preserve that thing that, you really love and has maybe given a lot to your life and your family, is a way to help really bring people into the journey, and certainly in a way that regenerative brands can do that other food brands just can't.
Yep.
Makes sense. No, and I think you're spot on. Anthony was smiling as you were answering the brands working together. That's my jam. That's what I'm hoping we can achieve as a movement, is working together. Because to your point, if we've got a 12 ties shopper who's aware that, hey, this is doing a great thing, and they might not know the next aisle over there's another brand doing the same great thing that aligns with their values. Like, the more we can connect those dots, the more we can make an impact as a movement, right? So I think you're spot on there. But super appreciate everything you shared, man.
Is expensive, but like, if we educate a consumer, like kind of spend money to educate a consumer, then like on the whole, like, regenerative benefits, like, we want to give that education to like other brands and like help, kind of fill out their grocery cart with like also all the other regenerative brands in every category of the store. And we would hope that those brands would do the same thing of, even though we educate this consumer, we want your whole cart to be, full of those ecologically positive products, and like, here's, the way you can do that. And so I think that lessens the burden of any individual brand to foot like the entire kind of consumer education bill, and the industry can like really work together to accelerate that.
It's like a collective regen ROAS. Like, how can we maximize our regen ROAS together?
Well, so we've got to close with another pun that sums that up pretty well, which is, the rising tide raises all ships, right? So
exactly.
Get that regen rising tide to take place and benefit all those brands at the same time.
Exactly. Thanks for joining us, Pat. This was super fun, man. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
For show notes, episode transcripts, and more information on our guests and what we discuss on the show, check out our website, regen-brands.com. That is regen-brands.com. You can also find our Regen recaps on the website. Regen recaps take less than 5 minutes to read and cover all the key points of the full hour-long conversations. You can check out our YouTube channel, Regen Brands Podcast, for all of our episodes with both video and audio. The best way to support our work is to give us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platform, subscribe to future episodes, and share the show with your friends. Thanks for tuning in to the Regen Brands Podcast, brought to you by the Regen Coalition and Outlaw Ventures. We hope you learned something new in this episode, and it empowers you to use your voice, your time, and your dollars to help us build a better and more regenerative food system. Love you guys.